in the dense, forgotten foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, nestled within a secluded valley ominously known to locals as Sorrow's Hollow. The trees grow thick and tangled, their branches interwoven like the gnarled fingers of skeletal hands. For decades, this place was a footnote on a map, a patch of wilderness reclaimed by nature, holding its secrets in a silent, suffocating embrace. The only monument to its past was the charred foundation of a large, imposing building, a ruin that locals spoke of only in hushed, fearful whispers. But in the spring of 1953, a land developer, armed with blueprints and a belief in progress, sent his bulldozers to clear the overgrown plot. It was then that the ground gave up its dead. The steel blade of a machine scraped against something that was not rock or root, and when the workers investigated, they uncovered the first of them, a small, flat stone with no name, beneath which lay the brittle, delicate bones of a child. They found another, and then another. By the time the sun set on that terrible day, they had unearthed 88 unmarked graves, a silent, orderly congregation of the lost. The official story, the one that had settled into the comfortable corners of local history, was that the Blackthorn Sanctuary for Wayward Youth had been consumed by a tragic fire in the winter of 1923, and all the children within had perished in the blaze. But these graves were not clustered around the burnt-out ruin. They were set apart in a hidden copse of trees, arranged with a chilling methodical precision that spoke not of a chaotic accident, but of a systematic, secret industry of death. The discovery shattered the placid surface of the past, and from the depths of a sealed county archive, forgotten documents were finally brought into the light. A terrified sheriff's private journal, a collection of unsent letters from a long-dead child, and the meticulous, coded ledgers of the sanctuary itself. These artifacts told a story far more horrifying than a simple fire, a story of a family that had built an empire on the suffering of the innocent. This is the macabre history of the Blackthorn family, a sinister tale that challenges everything we thought we knew about a quiet corner of America and reveals one of the darkest, most unsettling chapters in our nation's hidden history. This channel is not for everyone. We delve into the shadows that others fear to tread, and we give voice to the stories that have been deliberately silenced. If you are one of the brave souls who believes that the truth, no matter how disturbing, must be brought to light, then you have found your community. Subscribe to our channel now, and in the comments below, let us know what part of the world you are watching from, so we can see how far these stories are traveling. You are now part of the effort to ensure these forgotten victims are never truly lost to time. The story of the Blackthorn Sanctuary begins not with malice, but with a grand and noble vision, a flicker of apparent light in the darkening landscape of post-Civil War America. The year was 1888, a time when the nation was still binding its wounds, and the countryside was rife with poverty, dislocation, and a generation of children left orphaned or abandoned by circumstance. It was into this world of desperate need that Reverend Alistair Blackthorn strode, a man seemingly forged from biblical verse and pioneer steel. He was a traveling preacher of immense charisma, his voice a powerful instrument that could thunder with righteous condemnation of sin one moment and tremble with a father's gentle compassion the next. In town squares and makeshift revival tents, he spoke of a divine mission entrusted to him, to create a haven, a sanctuary for the lost lambs of society. He painted a vivid picture of a place where hungry bellies would be filled, where idle hands would be taught noble work, and where wayward souls would be guided back to the path of righteousness through discipline, prayer, and hard labor. His vision was intoxicating, a potent balm for a society grappling with its own failings. To the struggling townsfolk and the wealthy philanthropists in the cities he visited, Alistair's promise was salvation itself, a chance to invest in a project that was not merely charitable, but divinely ordained. And so, the donations poured in. Land was acquired in the isolated but beautiful valley that would later be renamed by tragedy, and the construction of the Blackthorn Sanctuary for Wayward Youth began. Overseeing the practicalities of this great undertaking was Alistair's younger brother, Gideon Blackthorn, a man who was his brother's opposite in every conceivable way. Where Alistair was all light and soaring rhetoric, Gideon was a creature of shadow and silence, a hulking, imposing figure who managed the construction crews with a quiet, menacing efficiency. Under his unblinking gaze, the sanctuary rose from the valley floor, but even in its creation, there were unsettling portents. The design, supposedly drawn up by Alistair himself, was severe and institutional, its architecture speaking more of control than of comfort. The walls were thick stone, quarried by the very men who would later whisper about Gideon's cold demeanor. The windows were tall and narrow, set high in the walls like the arrow slits of a medieval fortress, allowing light to enter, but offering no view of the world outside. It was built not like a home, but like a prison designed to keep its occupants securely within, and the world securely out. Completing the family triad was Alistair's wife, Ilara, a woman who presented herself as the gentle, nurturing heart of the entire operation. Trained as a nurse and possessing an encyclopedic knowledge of botany, she was to be the sanctuary's healer, the tender hand that would soothe the fevers and mend the scrapes of their young charges. She was seen planting extensive gardens around the main building, and her public face was one of serene, scientific benevolence. Together, the three Blackthorns formed a perfect, unassailable unit: the visionary, the enforcer, and the nurturer. They were the answer to a prayer, and as the first carriage of pale, wide-eyed orphans rattled down the dirt road into Sorrow's Hollow, the world saw only a noble family embarking on a sacred duty. They could not see the darkness taking root in the foundations of a sanctuary, nor could they imagine the true, monstrous purpose for which it was being built. The public face and resonant voice of the entire Blackthorn enterprise was, without question, Reverend Alistair Blackthorn. He was the architect of the dream, the charismatic leader whose perceived virtue was the bedrock upon which the sanctuary's reputation was built. To the outside world, he was a living saint, a man who had turned his back on worldly comfort to serve the most vulnerable. His sermons were legendary, not merely for their fiery delivery, but for their intellectual and emotional depth. He could weave together scripture, philosophy, and heartfelt anecdote into a tapestry of such persuasive power that congregations would sit in rapt, tearful silence. In a letter to her sister, one wealthy donor from Charleston wrote after hearing him speak, "I have today heard the voice of an angel on earth." Reverend Blackthorn speaks with the authority of God himself, and to deny his mission would be to deny a divine command. "I have given him everything I can spare, for in his hands it is not mere money, but a tool for the salvation of a generation." This was the power of Alistair. He did not simply ask for donations. He offered his benefactors a chance to participate in a grand, historical act of redemption. He made them feel that their wealth was not just building a school, but purifying a nation's soul. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of the holy man, there were unsettling currents. Those who spent more than a fleeting moment in his presence sometimes spoke of a strange duality in his eyes. They could shine with a messianic fervor that was inspiring, but in moments of quiet contemplation, or when observing one of his young charges, they could become as cold and dispassionate as a surgeon's steel. It was a predatory stillness, a flicker of something calculating and ancient that was quickly masked by a beatific smile. The philosophy he espoused was a twisted, severe interpretation of faith, one that emphasized the inherent sinfulness of the poor and the orphaned. He believed their waywardness was a spiritual disease that had to be burned out of them. Discipline was not just a tool for order. It was the crucible through which their souls had to pass. He spoke of breaking a child's will not as a cruel act, but as a necessary, even loving, one, a prerequisite for rebuilding them in a righteous image. This ideology provided the perfect justification for the cruelty that would later flourish within the sanctuary's walls. He spent a great deal of his time away from the Hollow, traveling on extensive fundraising tours that took him to the parlors and pulpits of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. He was a master of cultivating his own myth, ensuring that the sanctuary's reputation remained pristine in the minds of those whose money kept it afloat. These long absences were strategic. They allowed him to remain above the grubby, day-to-day workings of the institution, a distant, benevolent father figure whose hands remained metaphorically clean. He would return to the sanctuary periodically, striding through the grounds like a visiting monarch, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere. The children, already subdued, would become almost catatonically still, their eyes downcast. Alistair would perform inspections, deliver powerful sermons in the sanctuary's chapel, and perhaps single out a child for a public display of praise, or a chillingly calm, theological rebuke that was more terrifying than any physical blow. He was a master of psychological control, using his authority and his followers' faith as both a shield and a weapon. He was the sun around which the dark planet of the sanctuary orbited, and his light was so blindingly bright that no one could see the horrors that thrived in his shadow. If Alistair was the sanctuary's voice and soul, his wife, Elara Blackthorn, was its silent, methodical mind. While her husband traveled, charming the world with his vision, Elara remained entrenched in Sorrow's Hollow, the quiet mistress of the infirmary and the sprawling, meticulously organized gardens. To the few visitors who made the journey and to the children in her care, she cultivated the persona of the Angel of the Hollow. She was serene, soft-spoken, and possessed a seemingly endless knowledge of herbal medicine. When a child was sick with a fever, it was Elara who would appear with a steaming cup of willow bark tea. When a boy suffered a deep cut from working in the quarry, it was Elara who would calmly stitch the wound and apply a poultice of her own creation. She was the gentle counterpoint to her husband's fiery zeal and her brother-in-law's brutal presence. Her work was seen as the very embodiment of the sanctuary's compassionate mission, the healing hand that mended the broken bodies of these unfortunate children. However, the truth of Elara's work was far more sinister, and the clues were hidden in plain sight, in the very soil of her celebrated gardens. Alongside the chamomile, lavender, and peppermint grew another, more secret collection of plants. In a shaded, walled-off section of the garden, which she referred to as her special conservatory, Elara cultivated a pharmacopoeia of poisons. There were the elegant, bell-shaped flowers of Digitalis purpurea, the foxglove, capable of stopping a heart. There were the glossy, alluring berries of Atropa belladonna, the deadly nightshade, a single one of which could be fatal to a child. She grew hemlock, wolfsbane, and rare fungi, all tended with the same detached, scientific care she gave to her healing herbs. To her, these were not instruments of evil, but tools for a higher purpose, a set of solutions for problems that prayer and discipline alone could not solve. Her demeanor, upon closer inspection, was not one of gentle serenity, but of a chilling, clinical detachment. She moved with a preternatural calm, her hands steady, her eyes analytical. She recorded everything in a series of leather-bound journals, written in a precise, elegant script and filled with a complex code of her own invention. On the surface, these journals appeared to be simple records of the infirmary's activities, notes on illnesses, dosages of herbal remedies, and the progress of her patients. But woven into the code was a second, secret ledger. A passage, when decoded, might move from a simple observation to a terrifying conclusion. An entry might begin, subject 23, male, age 9, exhibiting signs of persistent defiance and spiritual malaise. It would then detail a series of treatments, innocuous-sounding tinctures and teas. But the final, coded notation would reveal the truth. The fever of the soul requires a more permanent solution. The spirit has proven resistant to correction. A final piece administered. A successful application of the conservatory's gifts. Elara Blackthorn was not a healer. She was a eugenicist, a scientist of death, who had perverted her knowledge to become the methodical heart of the family's criminal enterprise. She was the one who diagnosed the unfit, the children who were too weak, too rebellious, or simply too inconvenient. Her infirmary was not a place of healing. It was a laboratory, and her patients were not children, but subjects in a long, horrifying experiment in purification. And her most potent weapon was the trust she so carefully cultivated, the mask of the angel that concealed the face of a meticulous, patient monster. While Alistair preached and Elara plotted, the day-to-day mechanics of the Blackthorn Sanctuary's grim reality were managed by the third and most feared member of the family, Gideon Blackthorn. He was the practical enforcer, the silent, brutal hand that ensured the smooth, uninterrupted operation of the entire Sinister machine. If Alistair was the sanctuary's shining facade and Alara its secret engine, Gideon was its unyielding iron frame. He held no official title other than manager, but his authority was absolute and unquestioned. He was a monolith of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a stony, impassive face that rarely betrayed any emotion save for a simmering, barely contained violence. He was a man of few words, preferring to communicate through a cold, penetrating stare, a curt nod, or the menacing tap of the heavy, iron-topped cane he always carried. His presence alone was enough to enforce a deathly silence in the dining hall or to quicken the pace of the children laboring in the fields. His domain was the physical world of the sanctuary, the logistics of supplies, the management of the exhaustive work details, and, most importantly, security and discipline. It was Gideon who designed the children's grueling daily schedule, a routine calculated to induce maximum exhaustion and leave no time for independent thought or play. From before sunrise until after sunset, the children were forced into hard labor. The older boys worked in a nearby stone quarry, their small bodies hauling rocks that would be sold for the sanctuary's profit, while the younger children and girls tended to the vast vegetable farms that fed the institution and provided a surplus to be sold in town. This labor served a dual purpose. It was not only a source of revenue that flowed directly into the Blackthorn's private coffers, but it was also a powerful tool of control, leaving the children too physically broken to even consider rebellion. Gideon's most crucial role, however, was that of the enforcer. He was the one who administered punishments for any and all infractions. A whispered word after lights out, a dropped tool in the fields, a moment of hesitation. All were met with his swift and terrible attention. While he was not prone to loud outbursts, his cold, quiet brand of cruelty was far more terrifying. He was also the one who dealt with the most serious of transgressions, attempts to escape. The sanctuary's isolation was its greatest defense, but occasionally, a desperate child would make a run for the dense woods surrounding the hollow. None ever succeeded. Gideon, often accompanied by a pair of large, vicious dogs he kept chained near his private cottage, would hunt them down. A chilling local legend began to form around these failed escapes. Children would vanish, and the official explanation was always that they had successfully run away, lost to the wider world. But the other children knew better. They knew that to be caught by Gideon meant you were never seen again. Decades later, during Arthur Pendleton's investigation, an old farmer from a neighboring property would tell a story he had kept secret for years out of fear. One evening near dusk, he had been checking his fence line when he saw Gideon emerge from the woods, dragging a small, unmoving form behind him back toward the sanctuary grounds. The farmer had convinced himself at the time that the boy was merely unconscious or ill, but the image had haunted his dreams for 30 years. Gideon was the gear that allowed the Blackthorn machine to grind on. He was the one who got his hands dirty, the one who turned Alara's clinical sentences into physical reality, the one who patrolled the perimeter of their dark kingdom and ensured its secrets remained buried, both figuratively and, as the world would later discover, literally. For the first few years of its operation, the Blackthorn Sanctuary maintained its pristine reputation. The system the family had created was brutally effective, a closed loop of control where fear and exhaustion stifled any dissent from within, and Alistair's charismatic evangelism deflected any scrutiny from without. The children were isolated. Their letters home, for the few who had homes to write to, were heavily censored, and any who were adopted or placed with families were, in reality, victims who had been permanently silenced. The machine was running perfectly, but no system is infallible, and the first significant crack in the Blackthorn's monstrous facade appeared in the form of a 10-year-old boy named Thomas Mayhew. Unlike most of the sanctuary's residents, who were destitute orphans with no one to ask after them, Thomas was not entirely alone. He had been sent to the sanctuary by his widowed mother, a seamstress in a distant city who had fallen gravely ill and, believing Alistair's promises, saw the institution as a temporary, safe harbor for her son until she recovered. Thomas was different from the other children. He was not yet broken by a lifetime of hardship. He was literate, observant, and possessed a quiet but resilient spirit that had not yet been crushed. He arrived with a small leather-bound journal and a pencil, a gift from his mother, to record his adventures. He had no idea that this simple gift would become one of the most important chronicles of the sanctuary's hidden crimes. From the moment he arrived, Thomas sensed that something was profoundly wrong. He saw the unnatural fear in the other children's eyes, the way they flinched from Gideon's shadow, the hollow, rehearsed nature of their prayers. He began to document his observations in his journal, writing in a small, cramped script, hiding the book beneath a loose floorboard under his cot. He wrote about the meager, watery soup they were served, the grueling hours in the fields, and the constant, oppressive silence. Then, one evening, he witnessed the event that would transform his unease into cold, certain terror. A younger girl, a 7-year-old named Mary, had been suffering from a persistent, rattling cough. During the evening meal, she broke into a coughing fit that disrupted the silent reverence of the dining hall. Gideon's head snapped up, his eyes fixing on the small, trembling girl. He did not yell. He simply nodded once, a gesture that sent a ripple of fear through the room. After the meal, as the children were being marched back to the dormitory, Alara Blackthorn intercepted Mary. She placed a cool, calm hand on the girl's forehead and, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, announced that Mary needed a special rest and some quiet in the infirmary to help her recover. Thomas watched them walk away, Alara's arm firmly around the little girl's shoulder. He never saw Mary again. A few days later, during morning prayers, Reverend Alistair, who was present during one of his visits, announced with solemn gravity that poor Mary's illness had taken a turn for the worse, and that the Lord, in His infinite mercy, had called her home to His side. The children were instructed to pray for her soul. But Thomas knew something was wrong. Mary hadn't seemed that sick. In the secret pages of his journal, he wrote a passage that would one day be read in a hushed courtroom. Mary coughed too loud at supper. Gideon took her away. Sister Alara said she needed special quiet. It has been 3 days. Her bed is still empty. Today the Reverend said she is with God. But I saw Gideon last night walking toward the woods with a shovel. He did not see me in the window. I am afraid. God does not live in those woods. Thomas's journal was no longer a record of adventures. It had become a witness statement, the first internal account of the systematic disappearances, the first sign that the sanctuary's high mortality rate was not an act of God, but an act of the Blackthorns. The crack had appeared, and through it, the first glimmer of the horrifying truth was beginning to shine. The sanctuary continued its dark work undisturbed for more than 3 decades. Generations of children passed through its gates, their stories and their very lives erased by the brutally efficient system the Blackthorns had perfected. The whispers in the local community remained just that, whispers easily dismissed as rural superstition or malicious gossip against a man of God. The truth remained buried in the coded journals of Alara, the silent memory of Gideon, and the growing collection of unmarked graves in the woods. It would take an outsider, a man with no preconceived notions and a healthy dose of journalistic cynicism, to finally begin pulling at the threads of the conspiracy. In the late autumn of 1922, a young, ambitious journalist from the Philadelphia Inquirer named Arthur Pendleton was given what he considered a thoroughly uninspiring assignment. He was to travel to the backwoods of West Virginia and write a celebratory feature piece on the Blackthorn Sanctuary for Wayward Youth, which was approaching its 35th anniversary. The editor wanted a heartwarming story for the Sunday edition, a profile of the Venerable Reverend Alistair Blackthorn and his family's lifelong dedication to charity. Arthur, who dreamed of exposing political corruption and organized crime, saw it as a fluff piece. He packed his bag, his notepad, and his skepticism, and took the long train ride south, expecting to find a quaint, perhaps slightly inefficient, but ultimately benevolent institution. His disillusionment began the moment his hired car rattled up the long, isolated drive to the sanctuary. The building itself was the first red flag. It did not look like a home for children. It looked, as he would later write in his notes, like a penitentiary designed by a Puritan. The atmosphere was even more unsettling. As he stepped out of the car, the silence was what struck him first. It was not the peaceful quiet of the countryside, but a heavy, oppressive silence. There were no sounds of children playing, no laughter, no shouting. He was greeted by Reverend Alistair himself, now a venerable, white-haired patriarch. The charisma was still there, the voice as rich and compelling as ever. But Arthur, trained to read people, saw something else in the old man's eyes, a flicker of sharp, assessing intelligence, a sizing up of a potential threat. He was then introduced to the other two pillars of the family. Gideon, now grizzled and even more imposing, stood silently in the background, his presence a palpable weight in the air. Ilara, her face a mask of serene composure, offered him a cup of tea that he politely declined. It was the children, however, who solidified his unease into a burgeoning sense of dread. He saw them working in the fields as he arrived, moving with a listless, shuffling gait. Later, in the dining hall, he observed them up close. They were pale, unnaturally thin, and uniformly subdued. Their eyes were dull and vacant, except when Gideon or Alistair passed by, at which point they would flicker with a primal, hunted fear. They moved like ghosts, their spirits seemingly as malnourished as their bodies. Arthur attempted to conduct interviews for his article, but the experience was profoundly disturbing. With Alistair or Ilara present, the children would recite rote, rehearsed answers about their gratitude and the sanctuary's kindness. "The Reverend saved me," a young boy said, his voice a monotone, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. "We are taught the value of hard work and prayer," a girl whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. When Arthur managed to catch a young boy alone for a moment near the quarry, the boy simply stared at him, his face a mask of terror, before bolting away as if Arthur himself were a source of danger. It was clear these children were not just disciplined, they were terrified into absolute submission. This was not a sanctuary. It was a place of profound, systematic despair. The heartwarming fluff piece was dead. Arthur Pendleton now had a real story, and a dangerous one at that. He just had to find a way to prove it. Arthur Pendleton's journalistic instincts, now fully awakened, told him that the polished surface of the Blackthorn sanctuary concealed something rotten. His initial plan for a quick, 3-day visit was abandoned. He checked into a small boarding house in the nearest town, a dusty collection of buildings a few miles from the hollow, and began the slow, methodical work of an investigator. He knew that confronting the Blackthorns directly would be fruitless. They were masters of their own narrative. The truth, if it existed, would be found in the margins, in the hushed conversations and forgotten records of the community that had lived in the sanctuary's shadow for 35 years. He started at the town saloon, buying drinks for old-timers and listening to their stories. At first, he was met with suspicion. The Blackthorns were powerful, their influence extending far beyond the walls of their institution. But Arthur was patient and persistent. He learned to frame his questions not as accusations, but as historical curiosity. Slowly, the whispers he had read about began to take shape. He heard tales of children who had run off and were never heard from again, of strange lights in the woods at night, of Gideon Blackthorn's fearsome reputation. Most of these stories were dismissed as folklore, but they formed a pattern of fear and avoidance. His first major break came when he tracked down an elderly, arthritic farmer named Silas Croft, the same man who, decades earlier, had seen Gideon dragging a boy back into the woods. Fear had kept Silas silent for 30 years, but in Arthur, a determined outsider from a big city paper, he saw a final chance for the truth to be heard. In a hushed, trembling voice, Silas recounted the story, the details still seared into his memory. He described the boy as limp like a sack of feed, and the look on Gideon's face as one of cold, grim purpose. Next, Arthur turned his attention to the official records. At the county clerk's office, he requested access to the sanctuary's public filings, specifically its mortality reports. The clerk, a man deeply loyal to Reverend Alistair, was immediately hostile and obstructive. But Arthur, citing state public record laws, was persistent. After a day of bureaucratic stonewalling, he was finally given access to a dusty ledger. The numbers were staggering. Over 3.5 decades, the sanctuary had reported the deaths of over 60 children, an astonishingly high mortality rate even for the era. The causes of death were consistently attributed to common but severe illnesses: consumption, Spanish influenza, pneumonia, or tragic accidents. It was plausible on the surface, but the sheer volume was highly suspicious. It suggested either gross criminal negligence or something far worse. He then visited the local coroner, a man well into his 70s who had held the post for nearly 40 years. The coroner was evasive and defensive, insisting that every death had been properly investigated. But when Arthur pressed him on the lack of detailed autopsy reports, the coroner became flustered, claiming the sanctuary's isolation and Alara Blackthorn's own medical expertise made such measures unnecessary. It was clear to Arthur that the coroner was, at best, incompetent, and at worst, a willing accomplice, signing death certificates based on the word of the Blackthorns alone. The walls of the conspiracy were beginning to show. The Blackthorns had systematically insulated themselves, using their reputation, the town's fear, and the complicity of local officials to create an impenetrable fortress of lies. Arthur realized that to expose them, he would need more than just suspicious numbers and old stories. He would need undeniable physical proof from within the sanctuary itself. And as he sat in his small room, reviewing his notes, he knew that getting that proof would be the most dangerous task he had ever undertaken. It is at junctures like this in a story that the line between history and the present becomes blurred. The courage it takes to pursue a dark truth against a wall of silence is a timeless struggle. If you believe in the importance of that struggle, and in bringing stories like this one into the light, please take a moment to support our work. Like this video to help it reach more people, share it with someone you know who isn't afraid of the dark, and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to keep digging, to ensure that the Arthurs of the world have a platform, and the victims are never forgotten. Arthur Pendleton's investigation had now branched into a new, more dangerous territory. He had established a pattern of suspicious deaths and local corruption, but he lacked a motive powerful enough to explain the sheer scale of the horror he was beginning to suspect. The common vices of greed or cruelty seemed insufficient. The answer, he felt, lay in the Blackthorns' finances and the core ideology that drove the family. Working late into the night, he began a new line of inquiry, one that followed the money. He knew from his initial research that the sanctuary received enormous donations from wealthy patrons across the East Coast. He started by cross-referencing the sanctuary's public, charitable filings with land ownership and tax records in the state capital. It was a painstaking process of sifting through dry, dense documents, but a disturbing picture began to emerge. He discovered that Reverend Alistair Blackthorn, the man who preached a gospel of asceticism and service, was the sole owner of several large, profitable tracts of timberland and a number of holding companies with no obvious connection to the sanctuary's charitable mission. These companies were the recipients of large, regular payments from the sanctuary's own accounts, disguised as management fees or land leases. The donations meant to feed and clothe orphans were being systematically siphoned off to build a secret, personal fortune. The sanctuary wasn't just a house of horrors. It was a massively profitable criminal enterprise. Yet even this immense greed didn't seem to fully account for the methodical elimination of children. The motive felt deeper, more fanatical. The true breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Arthur contacted a colleague at his paper in Philadelphia and asked him to do a deep dive into Reverend Alistair's associations before he had founded the sanctuary. A week later, a package arrived at his boarding house. Inside was a collection of pamphlets and minutes from meetings of a fringe intellectual society from the 1880s, the American Purity and Advancement Society. It was a eugenics organization, one of the many that flourished in the dark corners of late 19th century thought. Enlisted as a founding member and keynote speaker was a young, firebrand preacher named Alistair Blackthorn. Arthur read the pamphlets with a growing sense of cold dread. In his speeches, Alistair laid out a terrifying philosophy. He argued that poverty, crime, and moral failings were not social conditions, but hereditary traits, a stain upon the bloodline of the lower classes. He preached that true charity was not to simply sustain the defective, but to ensure their unfit lineage did not propagate and weaken the nation. He spoke of creating human gardens, where the weeds could be carefully and permanently removed to allow the stronger flowers to grow. The Blackthorn Sanctuary for Wayward Youth was this human garden. It was never intended to be a place of salvation for all. It was a laboratory and a culling ground. The wayward youth it took in were subjects for a monstrous, decades-long eugenics experiment. This horrifying revelation recontextualized everything. Alara's medical work was not about healing. It was about identifying and eliminating those children she and Alistair deemed genetically defective, the chronically ill, the intellectually slow, the rebellious, and the defiant. Her coded journals were not just records of death. They were the data logs of her grim research. Her garden of poisons was not a secret hobby. It was an arsenal. Gideon's role, too, became terrifyingly clear. He was not just an enforcer. He was the groundskeeper of this human garden, the one tasked with disposing of the weeds that Alara identified. The unmarked graves in the woods were not the result of a covered-up accident. They were the final, logical outcome of the Blackthorn's core philosophy. The family's evil was a perfect, hellish trinity. Alistair's fanatical ideology provided the moral justification, Alara's perverted science provided the means, and Gideon's brute force provided the execution. Arthur now understood the full monstrous scope of what he was facing. It was not just murder, it was a systematic, ideologically driven extermination program, hidden behind a mask of Christian charity for 35 years. Arthur Pendleton now held the key to the Blackthorn's secret world. He understood their motive, their methods, and the scale of their crimes. But his knowledge was useless without incontrovertible proof. His editor in Philadelphia was growing nervous, warning him that accusing a figure as powerful and respected as Reverend Blackthorn of such monstrous deeds without ironclad evidence would not only be libelous, but would destroy Arthur's career and the paper's reputation. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but he needed a smoking gun. He needed to get his hands on one of Alara's coded journals or find physical evidence within the infirmary itself. He needed an ally on the inside. He found one in the most unlikely of places. During his visits to the nearby town, he had noticed a young woman, barely out of her teens, who worked as a scullery maid at the sanctuary. Her name was Sarah. Unlike the children, she was a paid employee who lived in the village and walked to the sanctuary each day. Arthur saw in her eyes the same haunted fear as the children, but also a spark of anger. He approached her carefully over several days, meeting her on the road as she walked home. At first, she was terrified and refused to speak to him, but he was patient, sharing what he had discovered, appealing to her conscience. He told her about the mortality numbers, the financial corruption, and the farmer story. Finally, she broke down. She told him of things she had heard but tried to forget, the muffled cries from the infirmary at night, the way children would simply vanish after being sent to see Alara, the sickeningly sweet, chemical smell that sometimes emanated from the infirmary's chimney. She had never seen anything definitive, but she knew in her soul that something terrible was happening. She was terrified of the Blackthorns, especially Gideon, but the weight of her silence had become unbearable. She agreed to help. Her role was simple but fraught with peril. She was to find a time when the Blackthorns were occupied, during the Reverend's lengthy evening sermon in the chapel, and unlatch a small rear window to the infirmary. The plan was set for a moonless Wednesday night. Arthur, dressed in dark clothing, crept through the woods he now knew held so many terrible secrets. He found the window unlatched as promised and slipped inside. The infirmary was even more chilling than he had imagined. It was unnaturally clean, sterile, and cold. The air hung heavy, with the scent of antiseptic and dried herbs. On a large oak desk, he found them, Alara's leather-bound journals. He didn't have time to decipher the code, but he knew these were the documents he needed. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something more, something undeniable. He noticed a small, thick door in the corner of the room, one he hadn't seen on his official tour. It was bolted from the outside. With his heart pounding, he slid back the heavy iron bolt and opened it. The room beyond was small, windowless, and soundproofed with thick padding on the walls. A single iron ring was bolted to the floor. The air was stale with the smell of fear and disinfectant. This was where the difficult cases were taken. As he backed out of the room, his flashlight caught the edge of a different book, a smaller, less formal ledger tucked beneath a stack of medical charts on the desk. This one was not in code. It appeared to be a log of her special conservatory plants and their effects. He flipped it open, and his blood ran cold. The entries were clinical, dated, and horrifyingly clear. He found one from years ago that read, Subject 47, Thomas P. Defiant strain. Resisted discipline. Administered tincture of digitalis purpurea in evening milk. Onset of arrhythmia noted at 2:45 a.m. Final peace achieved at 3:14 a.m. A successful purification. It was the smoking gun. It was the confession. He heard a sound in the main hall. The sermon was ending early. A heavy footstep. Gideon. Arthur grabbed the small ledger, shoved it inside his coat, and scrambled back toward the window. His escape a frantic, heart-stopping dash into the concealing darkness of the woods. With Alara Blackthorn's poison ledger clutched in his hand, Arthur Pendleton fled from Sorrow's Hollow, as if the hounds of hell were at his heels. He didn't stop until he reached the state capitol, bypassing the compromised local authorities entirely. In a whirlwind of frantic activity, he presented his findings to the state attorney general's office. He laid out the whole story. The financial records, the eugenics pamphlets, the testimony from the farmer, the impossible mortality rates, and now, the crown jewel of his investigation, the explicit, handwritten confession of Alara Blackthorn, detailing the murder of a child named Thomas with a poison she had cultivated herself. The state officials, initially skeptical of such a wild accusation against a man of Alistair Blackthorn's stature, could not ignore the chilling evidence of the ledger. The coded language, the clinical detachment, the correlation of a name with a poison. It was too specific, too damning to be a forgery. A secret, high-level investigation was launched. A state police raid on the Blackthorn sanctuary was planned with the utmost secrecy, scheduled to take place at dawn in 2 days' time. But the Blackthorn's web of influence was woven more tightly and stretched further than Arthur or the state investigators had anticipated. Someone within the system, perhaps the local sheriff catching wind of unusual state-level inquiries, or a political ally of Alistair's in the capital, sent a warning. A single, coded telegram was all it took. The Blackthorns knew that the world they had so carefully constructed was about to come crashing down. They knew that their decades of secrets were about to be unearthed. Faced with exposure and certain ruin, they made one final, monstrous calculation. They would not be taken. They would not stand trial. And above all, they would destroy the ultimate evidence of their crimes, the remaining children and the sanctuary itself. On a bitterly cold winter night, just one day before the planned raid, the residents of the nearby town were awoken by an angry, orange glow that filled the sky above Sorrow's Hollow. The Blackthorn Sanctuary for Wayward Youth was on fire. It was not an accidental blaze. It was a roaring, malevolent inferno. The old dry timber of the main building, likely aided by accelerants, went up in a terrifying rush of flame and smoke. The fire was so intense that by the time any help could arrive, the structure was already a collapsing shell, a funeral pyre of unimaginable scale. The official story, the one that the Blackthorns intended the world to believe, was born in that fire. It was a story of a tragic accident, a faulty furnace, or an overturned lantern, that had claimed the lives of all the remaining children, and it was assumed the heroic Blackthorn family who had surely perished while trying to save them. The fire was their final, desperate act of evil, a scorched earth policy designed to incinerate their crimes and transform them from monsters into martyrs. It was a lie that would be cemented into local history for the next 30 years, a horrifyingly successful cover-up that buried the truth of their systematic murders under a blanket of ash and a narrative of tragic, unavoidable fate. For a generation, the world would mourn the Blackthorn fire, never knowing that the real tragedy in Sorrow's Hollow was not the fire itself, but the cold, calculated evil it was designed to conceal. The immediate aftermath of the fire was a scene of chaos, grief, and confusion. The Blackthorn sanctuary was reduced to a smoldering, blackened ruin, a gaping wound in the heart of the hollow. As the embers cooled, a grim search was undertaken, but the intensity of the blaze had left little behind but ash, charcoal, and twisted metal. No bodies were ever formally identified in the wreckage of the main building. It was simply assumed that the fire had been so hot as to consume everything, including the small bodies of the children and the 3 members of the Blackthorn family. In the ensuing weeks, Reverend Alistair Blackthorn was eulogized across the country. Newspapers that had once published his sermons now published his obituary, hailing him as a martyr who died alongside the children he had dedicated his life to serving. He and his family were tragic heroes, victims of a cruel fate. Amid this tide of public mourning, Arthur Pendleton's story finally broke. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran his explosive exposé detailing the eugenics plot, the financial corruption, and the evidence of systematic murder he had uncovered. He laid out the entire conspiracy, accusing the Blackthorns of setting the fire themselves to cover their tracks and escape justice. But his story, which should have been a bombshell, was largely dismissed. In the face of the overwhelming narrative of the tragic fire, Arthur's accusations seemed monstrous and unbelievable. He was painted as a callous, opportunistic sensationalist, a mudslinging journalist defiling the memory of a martyred family for the sake of a lurid headline. The Blackthorns' powerful friends, who had benefited from their association for years, worked behind the scenes to discredit the story. Without the key witnesses, the children all presumed dead, and with the primary crime scene incinerated, Arthur's evidence, including the poison ledger, was deemed circumstantial or even fabricated. The state's investigation quietly fizzled out, closed due to a lack of actionable evidence, and the deaths of all principal suspects. Justice was not just denied, it was completely subverted. Arthur Pendleton's career was shattered. He was ostracized by the journalistic community and became a pariah. But he never recanted his story. The truth of what he had seen in Sorrow's Hollow became his life's obsession, a ghost that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He meticulously preserved all his notes, his transcriptions of the ledger, and the original pamphlets from the Eugenics Society, holding onto them as a private, desperate vigil for the lost children. The land itself became a place of local legend and dread. The hollow was abandoned, the road fell into disrepair, and nature began the slow process of reclaiming the scarred earth. The story of the Blackthorn fire evolved into a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to frighten children. The ruins were said to be haunted by the spirits of the orphans who had perished in the flames. For 30 years, the truth lay dormant, buried under a powerful lie, a haunting local legend, and the thick, tangled roots of the Appalachian forest. The world had forgotten, and the perfect crime seemed to have been committed. The Blackthorns, it appeared, had won. Time has a way of holding onto secrets, preserving them until the moment is right for their reveal. For 3 decades, the secret of Sorrow's Hollow lay buried, a cold case that existed only in the haunted memory of one disgraced journalist and the unspoken fears of a small, rural community. But the earth itself does not forget. In the spring of 1953, the roar of bulldozers finally broke the long silence of the hollow. A new era of post-war prosperity had come to the mountains, and a developer had purchased the cheap, overgrown land of the old Blackthorn estate with plans for a new housing subdivision. It was a man looking to build a future who would ultimately unearth the most terrifying secrets of the past. When the steel blade of a bulldozer churned up the first human bone, the work stopped. When the first unmarked grave was uncovered, the state police were called. And when the final count reached 88, a number far exceeding the number of children reported to have died in the fire, the old, forgotten story of Arthur Pendleton was violently dragged back into the light. The discovery of the mass grave was a seismic shock. These were not the victims of a fire. The bodies were buried in an orderly fashion, far from the burnt-out foundation of the sanctuary. They were the physical proof that a systematic, long-term disposal of bodies had taken place. This was not a graveyard of accident victims. It was the boneyard of a serial killer. Arthur Pendleton, now a stooped, white-haired old man living in quiet obscurity, heard the news. He came forward immediately, bringing with him the meticulously preserved records of his 1922 investigation, his detailed notes, his list of suspicious deaths, and most importantly, the stolen poison ledger of Alara Blackthorn. What had once been dismissed as the ravings of a sensationalist was now viewed as the key to a 30-year-old mystery. At the same time, another crucial piece of evidence emerged. The old county sheriff, who had been a young deputy back in the 1920s, passed away, and his private journals were unsealed as part of his estate. In them, he had privately chronicled his terror and complicity regarding the Blackthorns. One entry, dated from the year of the fire, was a chilling confession. Alistair has God on his side, but the devil in his family. I dare not cross them. Another child went missing from the town this week, taken to the sanctuary. His mother is asking questions. I will write it down as another runaway. It is all I can do. To challenge Gideon Blackthorn is to sign your own death warrant. The lie of the fire, so carefully constructed and so long believed, was utterly and finally shattered. Forensic science, though still in its relative infancy, confirmed that the skeletons belonged to children of various ages, and some showed signs of chronic malnutrition. The discovery of the graves was the reckoning. It was the moment the earth itself screamed the truth that human beings had tried so hard to silence. The ghosts of Sorrow's Hollow were no longer just a local legend. They were real, they had names, and they were demanding justice. The reopening of the Blackthorn case in 1953 became a national sensation. The story of a respectable, charitable family revealed as monstrous architects of a eugenics-driven murder plot captivated and horrified the public. With the physical evidence of the graves and the corroborating testimony from Arthur Pendleton's and the sheriff's journals, investigators began to piece together the full, chilling narrative. But one great question remained. What had truly happened to Alistair, Alara, and Gideon Blackthorn? The fire had been their alibi, their grand disappearing act, but no one believed they had perished in it anymore. A new investigation was launched, this time focusing on the family's secret finances. Working with federal agencies, investigators followed the money trail that Arthur had first uncovered 3 decades earlier. They discovered that in the week leading up to the fire, Alistair Blackthorn, using one of his shell corporations, had liquidated a massive portfolio of stocks and bonds, converting it into gold and untraceable bearer bonds. On the night of the fire, while the world was distracted by the spectacular blaze, the 3 Blackthorns had simply vanished into the darkness, carrying with them a fortune built on donated money and blood. The trail was cold, but investigators uncovered evidence of a passage booked under a false name on a cargo freighter bound for Buenos Aires, Argentina, a nation that was becoming a known haven for fugitives fleeing justice from Europe and North America. Though they were never definitively located, the evidence strongly suggested that the Blackthorns had successfully escaped, living out the remainder of their lives in luxury and anonymity, funded by their crimes. They were never arrested, never tried, and never forced to face the consequences of their actions. The legacy they left behind was one of pure, unadulterated evil, a chilling testament to the darkness that can fester behind a mask of virtue. Their crime was a perfect storm of pathologies. It combined Alistair's narcissistic, fanatical ideology, which gave him a divine justification for mass murder, with Alara's cold, scientific perversion, which provided the quiet, untraceable means of death. This was all enabled by Gideon's brutal, pragmatic enforcement, which ensured the system ran without internal or external threat. They were a closed, self-sustaining ecosystem of corruption, a family bound together not by love, but by a shared, monstrous purpose. They preyed upon the most vulnerable members of society, the children no one would miss, exploiting the public's desire to believe in goodness and their willingness to turn a blind eye to uncomfortable truths. In the years following the discovery, the site of the former sanctuary was transformed. The land was purchased by a state historical trust. The ruins were cleared, but the ground where the 88 graves were found was consecrated. using the sanctuary's old admission records, Arthur Pendleton's notes, and whatever scraps of information could be found. Researchers painstakingly began the process of giving the victims their names back. Small, simple headstones were erected, replacing the anonymous fieldstones. Thomas, Mary, Samuel. Each name was a reclamation of a life, a small victory against the all-consuming evil of the Blackthorns. The memorial at Sorrow's Hollow became a quiet, somber place, a permanent reminder of the children the world had tried to forget. The story of the Blackthorn family and the children of Sorrow's Hollow does not end with the naming of the dead. It resolves into a series of somber, disquieting reflections that echo far beyond the confines of that one forgotten valley. It stands as a profound and tragic cautionary tale, a dark chapter of American history that forces us to confront the uncomfortable realities of the past and our own present. The primary and most heartbreaking legacy is that of the victims themselves, the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of vulnerable children whose lives were stolen. They were targeted precisely because they were powerless, because they existed on the margins of society, without families to protect them or voices to cry out on their behalf. They were the orphans, the abandoned, the children of the poor and the desperate, whose disappearance would cause the fewest ripples. Their suffering was the fuel for the Blackthorns' ideological machine, and their silence was the foundation of its security. Their story is a brutal reminder of a society's ultimate moral test, how it treats its most defenseless members. The Blackthorn saga also exposes the societal failures that allow such atrocities to flourish. It highlights the seductive danger of unchecked charismatic authority. Reverend Alistair Blackthorn was able to build his empire of death because people wanted to believe in him. They were so captivated by his performance of virtue that they refused to see the darkness it concealed. This blind faith, coupled with a deep-seated societal prejudice that dismissed rural whispers as ignorance and viewed the poor as inherently flawed, created the perfect environment for the sanctuary to operate without scrutiny for over a generation. The story of Sorrow's Hollow is a testament to the fact that evil rarely announces itself with monstrous fanfare. More often, it wears a mask of righteousness, respectability, and benevolence, and it thrives when good people choose to look the other way. Finally, the narrative serves as a chilling memorial to the insidious power of ideology. The Blackthorns were not simple sadists. They were true believers in a twisted cause. They saw themselves not as murderers, but as purifiers, as gardeners weeding out the defective elements of humanity for a greater good. This conviction, this perversion of science and faith into a eugenicist dogma, is what made them so terrifyingly efficient and so utterly remorseless. It serves as a stark warning that the most dangerous atrocities in human history are often committed not by those who believe they are doing evil, but by those who are convinced they are doing good. As we look back on this sinister tale, we are left with haunting questions. How many other Blackthorn sanctuaries have existed in our history, their own unmarked graves still lying undiscovered beneath the placid surface of the past? What is our collective responsibility to unearth these forgotten stories and to listen for the whispers that society still tries to ignore? The final image is of the memorial in Sorrow's Hollow. 88 small, named headstones stand in silent testament. The wind whispers through the tall Appalachian trees, a sound like a long, drawn-out sigh. It is a sound of mourning, but also a sound of warning, a reminder that the past is never truly past, and that the ghosts of its victims will wait, however long it takes, for the truth to be told. If this story has moved you, if you believe that these histories must be preserved and shared, then please complete your initiation into our community of truth seekers. Subscribe to this channel and be sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the shadows. Comment below with your reflections on this story and share this video with others who are brave enough to confront the darkness. Your engagement is the light that ensures these stories are never again lost to history.